Welcome to Boatcast, a podcast on a boat where we gently float through stories. And this edition of the Boatcast is special. It is part of the Muziris International Spice Route Conference, which is being held right now at Kochi, at Bolgati Islands in Kochi. And we have invited, and they have invited scholars from 22 countries, and various scholars from across the state, that is Kerala and India. And so many scholars at one place, and that is like food for a person like me who's hungry to learn from such knowledgeable people, and it has spiked my curiosity. So I won't take much long. Today our guest is Dr. James Onley. Dr. James Onley is a friend. We have met a couple of times before, and his resume is lofty. And if that I were to read all of his achievements, this would increase the time. So I will just read a snapshot, if that's okay with you.
Snapshots
James.
are great.
James is the chair of Ahmed Siddiqui Chair in Gulf and Middle Eastern Studies and Professor of History. He specializes in history and heritage of the Gulf region, the Gulf's historical connection with South Asia, which is this part, and he archives, and he's played a seminal role in digital archival work, right? So much, it's a mouthful. He's the founding editor of the Journal of Arabian Studies. Before joining American University Sharjah, he was director of historical research at Qatar National Library, responsible for digitizing historical records for Qatar Digital Library, and the director of Center of Gulf Studies at the University of Exeter. So, man, that's James. That's you spent all your life studying.
It's
And
been
teaching.
a journey. Yes, it's been a journey. But before all this, I was also in the Army, Canadian Army, for 15 years.
What are you saying?
And I was a peacekeeper in Iraq at the end of the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. So,
Oh, that is
yeah.
a great beginning. So, James, as you see, this is there will be glitches, there will be fumbles, but that is how we want to keep this show. We want to keep it conversational.
Yeah.
We don't want to make it formal, but we want this to spike the interest of people who are watching it at home on the knowledge you have, and so that they can rabbit hole into your other papers, or they can into these studies. And we are seeing the young new generation, or the brave new world, which thinks differently, and we want to divulge information and divulge education to them in a different way. So that is the idea of the podcast. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
So now I have taken some notes.
Okay.
Army, that is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Why not the Navy? Because you have done so much of studies on the Indian Ocean and the Indian Ocean trade and Iraq and Iran and the Gulf. So why not the Navy?
Oh, I mean, I should have perhaps. I mean, my great-grandfather was in the Royal Navy. And before him, I had an ancestor in the Royal Navy during the American War of Independence. But he fought not against the Americans, but against the French Navy in the Caribbean. But I ended up in the Army just by chance. I had friends who were in the same unit, so I joined with them.
How come were you in Iraq at some point in time?
Yeah, I was embedded with the Iraqi army under Saddam Hussein in 1988. The war ended in August of '88. We arrived before the war ended. We arrived in Baghdad, and then when the war ended, we deployed to the front line. We were with Iraqi units, and our job was to simply go with them to the front line to witness Iranian ceasefire violations. And we'd write them up and report them back to headquarters in Baghdad. So I did that for half a year.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. And was it then that you were interested in Arabian studies, or were you interested in it as a child or as a young man?
Yes.
Just army happened to be.
Well, I guess I was in high school interested in history, very much so. Like here in India, you had the East India Company. In Canada, we had the Hudson's Bay Company. And we had all these Hudson's Bay Company forts. There was one near the city I grew up in Vancouver. There was one in Langley called Fort Langley. And I went there as a kid with a high school field trip. And you have these historical reenactors dressing up, in historical costumes, and that captivated my imagination. I then later joined Army Cadets with some friends from high school, and then it was in something called the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, which is one of these colonial units, modeled off of the mother unit, I guess, if you like, in Scotland. Then I joined the Army as a result of that. And the Canadian Army, like the Indian Army, has many traditions, that it's inherited from era of the British Empire, from, the British Army. And so when I was deployed to Iraq, I saw the Iraqi Army with these same traditions. And I thought, well, this is in the Arab world. What does Iraq have in common with Canada? Well, it turns out quite a lot. They were both part of the British Empire, and they had this shared military traditions. So I became fascinated by that. When I went back to Canada, I began my university career. I began to take history courses in these sorts of things: Middle East history, Arab history, British imperial history, and I just followed my interest. And I didn't have a career plan. And next thing I knew, I ended up with a PhD from Oxford University in Gulf history.
Oh, that's interesting. And interestingly, there is a lot of influence of Arab trade and Arab influence in this part of the world, Kochi and Muziris. So, uh, tell us more about that and how do you look at it?
Well, I mean, we're floating right now on sort of an offshoot, I guess, of the Arabian Sea, and we tend to view these oceans as separating continents and peoples, but in fact, they connect people. I mean, by boats, so once you realize that the coastal cultures and economies are actually interconnected, and so. The economies and cultures of Kerala have been interconnected with the Arabian Peninsula for, close to 2,000 years. There's a very famous historical text written in Greek called the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, which describes various ports and around the Arabian Sea, including Muziris, and it mentions in the first century AD Arabian ships docked here, right? So the connections go back at least 2,000 years, and therefore it's no wonder that once Islam emerged in the Arabian Peninsula, it quickly floated along these maritime trade routes and came to Kerala during the lifetime of the Prophet. And so the very first Muslim community and the very first Muslim were from Kerala. It was here that Islam came to India.
So, the Dhows, which are the famous carriers, the famous ships, an Arab idea, an Arab design, or were they an Indian design, or was it a mix of both?
So these connections are symbolized by the Dhow. So we tend to think of the dhow as an Arab vessel. We see them in Dubai, and there's a famous Dhow festival in Doha every winter, November, December. And it's in form, it's very Arab, and it's part of the national iconography of the GCC states, the Gulf Cooperation Council states, like the UAE, Oman, and so on. But in fact, these dhows are made of Indian wood, right here from Kerala, from the Malabar Coast, from Malabar teak. And the very first dhows were in fact made by Indian craftsmen. The Arabs came down here in smaller vessels along the coast, and they found this amazing, shipbuilding industry here in Kerala, and they began to commission dhows. And they still do. To this very day, there are dhows being built on commission by Gulf governments and Gulf millionaires, mostly around Calicut. But this building industry goes back to, millennia. And so the Arabs initially bought Indian dhows or ships, but in time they began to tailor them to their own tastes and needs and requirements. So then you had the occasion whereby Arab shipwrights would come here, hire a team of craftsmen, and then they would build the dhow here. Later on, they would ship the wood to the Gulf, and they would build the smaller dhows there with the usually using Indian tools, but Arab craftsmen and Arab shipwrights. But the largest dhows, the ones called the booms and the baglas, these are huge ocean-going cargo vessels. They were still built here because they were just simply too large to ship the wood all the way to Kuwait or Dubai.
And that's what made them a formidable trading community.
Without India, the Gulf Arabs, who are known as the Maritime Arabs, could not have then navigated the rest of the Indian Ocean all the way to China. So it was
Yeah.
India. India was crucial,
And
especially Kerala.
especially Kerala.
Yeah.
And also that Arabs were also the in between or the agents between Europe and Asia, were they?
Yes, so the Arabs, of course, came to India. Indeed, the name India comes from originally Persian, from Hind, which then the Arabs adopted, Al-Hind, from which we get the word Hindu, Hindi, Hindustan. All of that comes from the Achaemenid Empire at the time, over 2,000 years ago, when the Indus Valley was a part of the Persian Empire. And their name for the province of the Indus Valley was Hind, and later Hindustan, under the Sasanian Empire. And so over time, the Arab and Persian or the Gulf understanding of what constituted Hind or Hindustan gradually expanded from the Indus Valley to all of the Indian subcontinent. And so this concept of India being one place, one people, one culture, was originally conceived by the Khalijis, as they're known, or the Bandaris, the people of the Gulf, the Arabs and Persians of the Gulf.
You talk about in one of your papers that the war between East India Company and Qasims has been a pivotal point in changing the Arab world. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, today, under the modern sort of way of thinking, which is area studies, within academia, we think of people who work on India, they're part of South Asia studies. People who work on the Gulf, that's part of Gulf studies, which is part of a larger field called Middle Eastern studies. And this is now manifested in maps. So if you get a map of the Gulf region or a map of India, it stops. And you don't see the Gulf and India together. But when you put the two maps together, or you look at historical maps and you see the two regions together, they are incredibly close, so close. And so it's only natural that trade connections and cultural connections would grow over time. And so over the course of millennia, India and the Gulf have been part of the same empire on numerous occasions. Most recently, they were part of the Estado de India, the Portuguese Indian Empire, headquartered in Goa, just north of here. with outposts in, most famously in Hormuz, that was their capital, but around Oman, UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, they had all of these Portuguese forts, right? All reporting to Goa in India. And after the fall of the Portuguese Empire, eventually that was replaced by the British Indian Empire. And eventually the Gulf states, Kuwait, all the way down to Oman, were incorporated into the British Indian Empire, which was consisted of two parts. One was British India, which was colonies ruled directly by the British, and then the other were princely states ruled by their own rulers, Maharajas, Nizams, Sultans, Sheikhs, Emirs, which had their own currency, their own flags, and so on. And so the Gulf states were incorporated into that world. So constitutionally, the Gulf was a part of India up until 1947. And the reason for this was when the Portuguese came and then when the British came, it was only natural that these intense trade ties and cultural and social and so on ties between India and the Gulf would eventually become politicized. That the Portuguese and later the British would follow these trade routes and establish trading outposts in the Gulf itself, and then eventually seek to control those trade routes and then to control the regions. So the Gulf during the British Indian Empire was a buffer zone to protect British India until 1947. So what did this look like on the ground? When you went to Dubai, let's say in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, you would buy a stamp which would have the Emperor or Empress of India on it. You would pay for it with an Indian rupee, and you would buy it from somebody from the Indian Postal Service who was part, and the Gulf region was incorporated into the Bombay Postal Circle. So then you would post that letter with them. It would go on a British Indian Steam Navigation Company ship all the way to Bombay, where it would be sorted and then was sent on its way to Japan or New York or wherever. So in so many ways, the Gulf states were an integral part of India up until 1947.
That's interesting. But the Arab world, I'm not calling it Gulf, but the entire Arab world, uh, I'll not come to the Qasims as yet, had a different structure, social and political structure. Um, there's a famous war you talk about, conquest of the East India Company and the Qasims, um, which changed everything. But more than that, we are talking about smaller tribes. And you write that they had divisible sovereignty, and the West came with the as idea of an indivisible sovereignty. So let's dive into that.
Okay, well, the Arabs were, once they began sailing around the world, around the Indian Ocean, on boats built with Malabar teak, often built along the Malabar Coast, um, they tapped into these Indian trade networks that India had already with China, and so they began to sail along these routes. And it's only natural that you have cultural exchange, the most, and cultural influence, the most significant of which, of course, is the spread of Islam. So Islam came first to India here in Kerala through trade, and what you have is the adoption of Islam to local circumstances and forms and so on. So the shape of Islam in India is different from Arabia. The shape of Islam in China is different. You can see this in the form of the mosques, for example, or the people and whatnot. So when Islam arrived here, what you have is a process of settlement, integration, and intermarriage between the Arabs and the Indians, the result of which is the Mapla community, which account for the majority of all Muslims on the Malabar Coast and 25% of all people in Kerala. They are the physical manifestation of the antiquity of the connection between India and the Arabs and the Islamic world.
Oh, that's interesting. There is a intermarriage of ideas in architecture, ideas in food, and you believe that it is because you said that the structure of a mosque in India is different from that in China?
So here, well, if we go back in time, you take a look at local mosque or church architecture when these religions emerged, they would typically use a pre-existing building rather than invent one, and that would be a building that was used for something else. In the case of the spread of Islam, when they would move into an area, they would use another religious structure that was either confiscated or no longer used. With the spread of Islam in what is now the Arab world, but also in Turkey, churches were the usual building. So they would simply adopt a church and convert it. The most famous example of this is what we consider the Turkish mosque, the Ottoman mosque, which is a domed structure, which is quite unique, with the four minarets. Now, the very first one was the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul.
Yeah.
Well, that's actually a Greek Orthodox cathedral. And so after the Ottoman conquest of Istanbul in 1453, Mehmed the Conqueror, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, confiscated the building, which was then the largest building in Europe, and converted it into a mosque. So today, when we view mosques from Turkey, we think, oh, that's a Turkish mosque, that's an Ottoman mosque, but in fact, it's a Greek Orthodox cathedral that's been repurposed, right? In the same way, here in Kerala, when the first Muslims arrived, they were granted permission to use some buildings for mosques. So they were given abandoned Buddhist temples. After Buddhism disappeared from Kerala, there were these empty structures. So the government said, you can have these. So they inhabited those, and that explains the unique architectural style of mosques here in Kerala.
When you mean the government, you
At the
mean
time.
kingdoms.
The kingdoms.
Kingdoms.
Yes.
And you pointed out that they appropriated structures and took over structures and made it demos, like what they did in Istanbul. In your paper, you write that piracy was encouraged in the Arab world as it was okay to be a pirate, is it?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, you have piracy, I think, in all societies and cultures. Piracy occurs in, of course, international waters where no one government is sort of controlling it. It usually arises out of conditions of severe poverty, where there's intense competition. And so this happened in the late 1700s in the Gulf region. And it was mixed with a form of Wahhabism, which is a very puritanical, expansionist form of Islam that came out of Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia, that's right. And so, they saw piracy as a form of jihad. What they're doing is that they're permitted by God to take from non-believers, right? So they would extend their jihad to the Gulf region, and they would start, boarding ships and taking goods or taking the ships. So this became problematic when this happened to East India Company ships. And both what they call country ships, these are Indian ships, but the Indians were British protected people or British subjects, and so they were entitled to British protection. So the East India Company became greatly concerned. They sent in a number of naval expeditions to, try to suppress this piracy. In fact, what was going on was a lot more complicated than this. And it was a sort of good example of the colonial mentality, of a simplistic view of what's going on, and the British misinterpreted what was going on, then imposed their solution on the people of the Gulf. So, in fact, there were three things going on. One was, of course, piracy as we understand it in international law today, and that was being, practiced by, pirates, thieves, not by governments necessarily. Then you have maritime raiding, what we call privateering, which is legal in all countries, whereby if India is at war with another country, they will grant what they call letters of marque, or an authorizing letter allowing them to raid the commercial ships of the enemy state, right? So if you're at war with that state, you can raid them, and that's legal. The British did this during World War I, World War II. They would raid German ships. And then the third one is punishment for toll evasion. If you can imagine trying to sail your ship through the Suez Canal and not pay the Egyptian government a toll for passage, well, the Egyptian government will seize your ship until you pay the fee. So all three things were going on in the Gulf. We have records showing that when the British were meeting with the ruler of Sharjah and Ras Al Khaimah, and they said, "Why are you raiding our ships?" They said, "Well, we're not raiding your ships. You're evading tolls. You have to pay a passage to go through the Strait of Hormuz, and we control it, so you have to pay us. And if you don't, we'll seize your ships." And so the British said, "Well, we pay tolls to no one, right?" And so, and then you also have, like I said, warfare, maritime warfare. And so what happened was, on two occasions in 1808, 09, and then in 1819, 1920, the British sent two flotillas to what is now the UAE, to Ras Al Khaimah, where they bombarded the shores, bombarded the port, and tried to sink the fleet, which they succeeded a little bit in 1808, and completely succeeded in 1819. And after which they imposed a treaty called the General Treaty of Maritime. So this treaty was called the General Treaty of 1820, which was imposed on the rulers of what is now the UAE. The rulers of Bahrain also signed it, and this forbade piracy, all forms of piracy. And in the event of piracy, you would go to the British, to the Indian Navy, then at the time called the Bombay Marine, and they would then find the pirate for you and get your ship back or your goods back. Eventually, this was upgraded to something called the Maritime Truce, and about 15 years later, and that banned all forms of maritime, violence, including warfare. And this effectively put what is now the UAE, and as well as Qatar and Bahrain later on, under British naval protection. And this was the beginning of the incorporation of the Gulf states into the British Indian Empire.
This was around which year?
Well, the Maritime Truce was 1835, and after the signing of the Maritime Truce, the signatures of this, which is now the UAE, became known as the Trucial Coast and the Trucial States. So the treaty itself became a defining feature of these states. These were 7 separate states. But they eventually unified into a single state, the United Arab Emirates. So the British involvement, British Indian involvement, was crucial for state formation for all of these Gulf states.
So they used if I were to put it simplistically and linear way, so the Arabs had the trade routes, they had the ships, they had the knowledge, wisdom, and the British had the might. Maybe the military might, which the Arabs probably missed. Was it because they were tribes and not one big unit?
Well, so don't forget the British were piggybacking off of India. These ships, the British power in the Gulf region was maritime, it was naval power. And while these ships were built in India, of Indian wood as well, just like the Arab ships, and while their captains and petty officers and so on were British, the crew were Indian.
Oh.
So 90+% of the people involved in the British Indian Empire, as well as in the Indian Civil Service, the Postal Service and all that, were Indian. So in fact, the British Indian Empire was an empire run by Indians for the British.
Yeah, because the British only got officers. The men, I mean, it sounds sexist, but they used to call it men. The men were all Indian. The sailors and the foremen and so on, right? The workers.
Yeah, indeed. It's a bit of a misnomer, really, to call it British involvement, because the local political representatives of the East India Company in the Gulf in the 17 and early 1800s were Indians. They were Indian merchants. So there was only 1, 2, or 3 British officers in the entire Gulf region, and then everybody else were Indian or Persian or Arab. So the very first British treaty that the British signed with the Gulf Arabs was the treaty between the East India Company or the government of India, Oman, the Sultan of Oman, which was signed in 1798. Well, the person who negotiated that was Indian. He was an Indian Persian,
Oh, is it?
Mehdi Ali Khan, who had previously served in other positions as a political representative in princely India. And then he was sent to Oman in 1798, and he negotiated this treaty. So the very first British Arab treaty was signed and negotiated by an Indian Persian.
Oh, and we think it was only done by the British and not any Indian were in collusions, but maybe the business interest of many Indians would have been on that side.
Well, in fact, I mean, while the British were supposedly in charge, we now know that they thought they were in charge. Often they were being used by people, and being told one thing in order to get them to do this or to do that.
Yeah, but they wielded the power.
They did wield the power, yes.
They did wield the power, and they had a large area to cover, almost half the world.
True. But without India, they were powerless.
That is true.
So it had to be a partnership, and so this is a crucial thing. If you look at imperialism as a spectrum, at one end you have resistance, armed resistance, and at the other end you have collaboration, and in the middle you have acquiescence, and you have this full spectrum. Gandhi was famous for non-cooperation, non-violent non-cooperation, which is very powerful. But at any time, people will move along that spectrum. Gandhi himself was on the side of cooperation, collaboration. He bought into the whole British system and ideals.
For sure.
Well, initially, he was, of course, started as a lawyer. But once he realized the hypocrisy of the British system, the racism, the institutional racism, and so on, that's when he moved to non-cooperation and so on. But so we see the spectrum, but empire is only possible where you have acquiescence, cooperation, or collaboration by the majority. And so the British India exercised a tremendous amount of influence and power in the Arab world militarily. Most of the people who were there representing this might were Indians wearing British Indian uniforms.
Now, let me come to the point of putting a structure to this Arab world and coming back to the Arab world, where they had a rector, an actor, which you mentioned, and then the actor could be a vassal, or and then the local players or smaller players. So how did that work? Was the rector like a military position?
Oh, I don't understand. Rector?
Yeah, you have mentioned in your paper, one of your papers, that they had a structure which is like a suzerain system of governance where you take the local power, but we will run the administration for you. That happened a lot in the Arab world?
Oh, yes. So most of the systems that the British used were actually invented and refined here in India.
Oh.
And the British had basically two systems of rule. One is direct rule, colonies.
And this is, I'm specifically talking about the Arab world.
Oh yes, yes. So so this I'll get to the Arab world in a minute. So one is direct rule, the other is indirect rule. Indirect rule is far more cost effective because the country that you take over covers all expenses. In a colony, the British would have to pay for everything, including the schools, the public works, and so on. But in a protected state or protectorate, it was the local government, local ruler who would pay for everything, and the British would only handle those things or control those things that they really cared about, which was usually foreign affairs and defense. So they first worked this system of indirect rule out here in India, in princely India. They then expanded that to the Arab world. That was the first place they expanded that to, beginning with the Gulf states, and then later on to the rest of the Arab world, and then also to Africa. The indirect rule works like this. Where you find a ruler who's willing to hand over his foreign affairs and defense, to the British or to a colonial power because his neighbors are threatening to invade, then you'll find a ruler who's usually willing to do that. Sometimes they're not, and so they're coerced into that. Now, once that happens, you will have a spectrum of involvement. Sometimes the British will not be involved at all in domestic affairs, and so there's a very light footprint. At other end of the spectrum, you'll have very heavy footprint. And so in those cases where there's a very light footprint, you usually have a relatively good colonial record. Very few instances of British, suppression, intervention, undermining of local, the local will, or forcing of the local ruler to do something that he otherwise wouldn't want to do. Now, in the Gulf states, the British were very, very light on the ground, largely to the environment. It was too hot, and people that they sent out there would usually die from the environment. So instead, most of the people in the Gulf who were representing the East India Company were Arabs, Persians, and Indians. And so the British were not even there, except in their headquarters in Bushehr in Iran. And they would do an annual tour to check up on things, but that was it.
So we are heading back, and we are almost at the end of
Okay.
end of our session. But I want to talk to you about in the last few minutes as we are heading back. How did this all change, and America got into the entire world where British had an influence, a substantial influence, and when oil started being discovered, America really took the lead, and it was the entire Arab world just shifted very swiftly
Yeah.
its allegiance towards America. How did this whole thing happen?
Well, so the crucial date is 1947. So in 1947, India becomes independent. We have India and Pakistan. And the question was then, should Britain also pull out of the Gulf because it's part of the Indian Empire, right? Logically, they should have. But they didn't want to because there was oil there. And all of the oil companies were either under British control or, except for Saudi Arabia, so and the largest shareholder of these oil companies was actually the British government. So they received more money from the oil in the Gulf than the Gulf governments themselves. So this is economic imperialism. So they decided to stay on. So then the question became, well, what happens to all of these British, these political agencies? Today we call them embassies. They're all the property of the government of India. Right? So technically, really, these embassies should have been handed over to the government of India, or, also some to Pakistan. But possession is 9/10 of the law, and the British said, no, we're going to keep them. So they took this government of India property, and these became British embassies. And then the Gulf states remained under British protection until 1971, when they pulled out for financial reasons. They couldn't afford to maintain a military force there any longer. At this point, the Gulf states were very concerned about protection, because once the British pulled out, they were afraid that Saudi Arabia would annex some countries. For example, Iraq will annex Kuwait. It certainly tried to in 1961. It succeeded in 1990. Iran would annex some places. It did. It annexed some territory as well. And so they needed an outside protector. And so the British negotiated an arrangement with America to come in and to take over responsibility for protecting the shipping routes, about 25% of the world's oil needs. So America eventually stepped in small steps, eventually to take over the role of the British. Combined with this, after 1947, in the 1950s, you have the emergence of Arab nationalism. There's now the breaking of the tie, the political tie with India. And so there was a reorientation of the Arab world away from India and towards the Arab world and the West. And this was helped by airfare. Now you could fly to different places. So previously Cairo was quite far from Dubai. It would take a long time to sail there. Now you can fly there in a few hours. So So the economic ties between India and the Gulf separated. The Gulf states became economically self-sufficient because of oil. They began to then turn their economies towards the Arab world in the West, as well as to, say, Japan, Korea. And so trade ties with India weakened. But then what happened was the Gulf states in the 2000s developed the Gulf Looks East policy, which was to re-engage with these historical trading partners, notably India, China. And then when Modi came to power 10 years ago, 11 years ago, he introduced the Link West policy, which was to re-engage with the Gulf. So under Modi, the economic ties between India and the Gulf states have returned to their historic high levels of intensity, just as they were when they were part of the Indian Empire. And so that's where we are today.
Yeah, but as you said in your, you just said that America was invited by the British to take care of the Gulf routes, and then they stayed and they dominated. America is the oil is the magnet that attracts America, isn't it?
Well, yes, but no. It's not the oil itself, it's the money that the Gulf states get from the sale of oil, which they then invest in America, as well as France and the UK. This is why, for example, Kuwait was rescued by a large coalition of countries in 1990 after they were occupied by Iraq, because they had invested very heavily in America, the UK, France, and so on. And so Kuwait was their best customer. All the Gulf states have done this as well. They've invested very heavily. And so they've also engaged in bilateral defense treaties and other sorts of strategic cooperation, including India. So that if another Kuwait scenario were to happen again, many countries, a large coalition would come to their rescue. Yes, America is the largest security provider, but you don't want it to be the sole provider. They learned their lessons from the British. The British were the sole security provider for the Gulf states, and that put them in a unique position to basically exercise a huge amount of influence. They didn't want that again, so while now they depend on America, they also depend on other countries, including India, Britain, France, and so on.
Lastly, and I want to end this show by asking you, what do you see as a future? Because renewable energy is coming in, everybody is talking about sustainability, and oil will last only that much. It will last a few hundred years, but then what? How is the Arab world, the Gulf, preparing itself for this eventuality? Are they getting ready? And how is their relationship with India, with the West, China? All these factors coming into play, and that we will that we should look into the future, and that we'll end this show with.
Okay. Well, what you're talking about is peak oil.
Yeah.
And that's the point at which oil sales begin to decline and the price of oil begins to decline because global demand begins to decline. We're not there yet. They keep saying it's several years off, and they keep pushing that off. But all the Gulf states have economic diversification policies in place. The countries that are probably the most advanced in this respect are Qatar and the UAE. The other Gulf states are following. And they're diversifying into things such as tourism. And this is where the Muziris Heritage Project comes into play, because the Gulf's historical links with India is a part of that heritage. So investing in things like this, like the government of Kerala is investing in the Spice Routes Conference that I'm here for, is one example of that economic diversification. And so another is foreign direct investment. I think the Gulf states are very keen to invest in India, and they're inviting Indian investment in the Gulf states, especially in the UAE with the Golden Visa. Where one can buy property in the UAE and then you get basically a like permanent residency. And one of the largest groups of buyers are Indians who've worked in the UAE their whole life, and now they can buy property and live there after retirement. So you're seeing this type of economic activity. I think India is key for that. I think India is a crucial part of the Gulf states' diversification plans, and this is why India is a strategic partner for many of the Gulf states, especially the UAE.
And they should invite us to do a boatcast in the Gulf, and we
Yes.
will call scholars. You will be with me, us then too. You
Yes.
will help us do it. It's so nice, and I hope you had a good time. And James,
Thank
it's
you.
always a pleasure talking to you. So much to learn every time I speak to you.
Well, we'll see you
Until you have a
next.
good time.
Thank you so much. And we'll see you next in Dubai for a boatcast on an Arab Dhow, Arab Indian Dhow in Dubai.
Inshallah, as they say.